On a frost-covered Tuesday morning in January 2025, Detective Lisa Romano's phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m. with the kind of call that changes everything. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Mike Patterson of Hancock County, Mississippi, and his words carried the weight of nearly 5 decades of frustration. "We got him, Lisa. Robert Sullivan's in custody. Audrey Hayes can finally rest." The arrest warrant for Robert Eugene Sullivan, now 67 years old and living quietly in a modest trailer home outside Meridian, had been signed just hours earlier. For 48 years, 11 months and 16 days, Audrey Hayes's case file had gathered dust in the basement of the Hancock County courthouse, a testament to small-town limitations and the cruel passage of time. The manila folder, worn thin at the edges and stained with coffee rings from countless late nights, contained evidence that seemed worthless by 1980s standards, but would prove to be Sullivan's undoing in an age of genetic miracles. Sullivan himself appeared unremarkable as he was led away in handcuffs, his grey hair thinning and his face bearing the weathered look of a man who'd spent decades working construction jobs across the Gulf Coast. Neighbors described him as quiet, helpful with their yard work, the kind of man who nodded politely at the grocery store and never caused trouble. None of them knew that the teenager who had once lived 3 miles from Audrey Hayes's family farm had been carrying a secret that had poisoned every day of his adult life. The impossibility of it all struck everyone who heard the news that January morning. How does a case that every law enforcement officer in Mississippi had given up for dead suddenly spring back to life? How does a girl who vanished without a trace in 1976 finally get justice when most of the people who searched for her have already been buried themselves? The answer lay in a combination of technological advancement and one detective's refusal to let sleeping cases lie, but the emotional reckoning was only just beginning. Sullivan's arrest sent shockwaves through communities that had long since moved on from the tragedy of Audrey Hayes's disappearance. The case had become local folklore, the kind of story older residents would share with newcomers as evidence of how even the safest places harbored dark secrets. Parents had used Audrey's name as a cautionary tale for their own children, never imagining that the person responsible might have been living among them all along, fixing their fences and plowing their driveways after winter storms. In the holding cell of the Hancock County Sheriff's Department, Sullivan sat with his hands folded in his lap, finally facing the moment he had dreaded for nearly 50 years. The walls of that small room had heard thousands of confessions, denials, and desperate pleas, but they had never contained a secret quite this old or this devastating. When Detective Romano first sat across from him, she could see in his eyes the relief of a man who had been running from himself for longer than some people had been alive. The last confirmed sighting of Audrey Elizabeth Hayes occurred at 6:23 p.m. on June 15, 1976, when Mrs. Dorothy Hayes spotted the 16-year-old girl pedaling her blue Schwinn bicycle down County Road 347, her blonde hair streaming behind her like a banner in the humid Mississippi evening. Mrs. Hayes was watering her prize-winning tomatoes when Audrey waved from the road, the same cheerful gesture the girl had offered countless times before. It was an image that would haunt Mrs. Hayes for the rest of her life, knowing she had witnessed the final moments of Audrey's freedom without understanding their significance. Audrey had left the Hayes family farm that evening with a specific purpose: to meet her best friend, Jennifer Walsh, at the swimming hole near Beaver Creek, a popular spot where local teenagers gathered during the oppressive summer heat. Her mother, Margaret Hayes, had given permission with the usual warnings about being home before dark and staying away from the deeper parts of the creek. Audrey had laughed, kissed her mother's cheek, and promised to be careful, the kind of ordinary exchange that becomes unbearably precious only in retrospect. The Hayes farm occupied 120 acres of rolling hills and pine forest, isolated enough to provide privacy, but close enough to the main road that Audrey had never felt unsafe during her evening bicycle rides. Her father, Thomas Hayes, had moved the family there from Jackson 5 years earlier, seeking the kind of life where children could roam freely and neighbors looked out for one another. The irony of that decision would become a source of lifelong torment for both parents. When Audrey failed to appear at the swimming hole, Jennifer initially assumed her friend had been delayed by farm chores or decided against the trip. It wasn't until 8:30 p.m., when Margaret Hayes called the Walsh house looking for her daughter, that anyone realized something was wrong. The search began informally, with family, friends and neighbors combing the route between the Hayes farm and Beaver Creek, calling Audrey's name into the gathering darkness. By 11 p.m., when flashlights began sweeping through the woods and Sheriff James Boyle had been notified, the discovery that would define the case had already been made. Audrey's bicycle lay in a ditch beside County Road 347, approximately 2 miles from her home and a mile short of her destination. The bike showed no signs of mechanical failure or accident, and Audrey's small purse still hung from the handlebars, containing her weekly allowance of $3 and a tube of cherry lip gloss she'd bought that afternoon. The scene defied easy explanation. There were no skid marks on the asphalt, no signs of struggle in the soft earth beside the road, no torn clothing caught on the barbed wire fence that separated the roadway from Miller's pasture. Audrey Hayes had simply vanished, leaving behind only the bicycle that had been her constant companion and the terrible silence that would echo through Hancock County for decades to come. The investigation that followed would test the limits of a small-town sheriff's department and ultimately expose how unprepared rural law enforcement was for crimes that defied their understanding of how evil operated in their quiet corner of the world. The Hayes family farm became the epicenter of the largest search operation in Hancock County's history, transforming peaceful pasture land into a maze of emergency vehicles, volunteers, and grim-faced officials who understood they were racing against time in a battle they might already have lost. Sheriff James Boyle, a man who had handled his share of domestic disputes and cattle theft, but never a missing child, found himself coordinating resources he didn't have for a case that demanded expertise beyond his small department's capabilities. Within 48 hours of Audrey's disappearance, nearly 300 volunteers had descended upon the rural community, their cars lining every available space along County Road 347 and spilling into neighboring fields. The Hancock County Volunteer Fire Department organized search grids through the dense pine forests that surrounded the Hayes property, while members of the local Methodist and Baptist churches provided food and coordination from a makeshift command center established in the Hayes' barn. The sound of voices calling Audrey's name echoed through the woods from dawn until dusk, a heartbreaking chorus that seemed to grow more desperate with each passing hour. Margaret Hayes moved through the chaos like a woman possessed, clutching a recent school photograph of her daughter and pleading with every searcher to memorize Audrey's face, her bright blue eyes and the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall. Thomas Hayes worked alongside the volunteer teams with methodical determination, his farmer's knowledge of the local terrain making him invaluable to search coordinators, even as the effort slowly destroyed him from within. Neither parent would sleep for more than an hour at a time during those first critical days, sustained by coffee and the desperate hope that the next radio call would bring news of Audrey's discovery. Sheriff Boyle established his command post in the Hayes' kitchen, the same room where Audrey had eaten breakfast just days earlier, and the intimate setting made the investigation feel both more urgent and more personal than anything he had ever handled. The telephone rang constantly with tips from concerned citizens, reports of suspicious vehicles, and offers of assistance from law enforcement agencies across the state. Every lead required follow-up, every piece of information demanded verification, and Boyle found himself coordinating with the Mississippi State Police and FBI agents who arrived to assist with the investigation. The involvement of federal authorities brought both hope and a sobering reality to the search effort. FBI Special Agent Robert Vance, dispatched from the Jackson field office, carried with him the authority and resources that local law enforcement lacked, but his presence also signified that Audrey's disappearance had crossed into territory that small-town officials were unprepared to navigate. Vance's methodical approach to evidence collection and witness interviews represented a level of sophistication that impressed Sheriff Boyle, while simultaneously highlighting the limitations of his own department's initial response. As the search entered its second week, the volunteer effort began to take on the characteristics of a religious crusade, with participants driven by a combination of genuine concern for the Hayes family and a growing awareness that Audrey's fate could easily befall any of their own children. Local businesses donated supplies and equipment, while radio stations throughout Mississippi broadcast regular updates that kept the case in the public consciousness. The story had captured something deeper than mere sympathy. It had tapped into every parent's worst nightmare and transformed a rural community into a place where strangers worked alongside neighbors in pursuit of answers that seemed increasingly elusive. The psychological toll on the searchers themselves became apparent as the days stretched into weeks without meaningful progress. Volunteers who had begun the effort with optimism and determination found themselves struggling with the reality that their best efforts might not be enough to bring Audrey home safely. The weight of responsibility pressed down on everyone involved, creating an atmosphere where hope and despair existed in constant tension, and where each new day brought the possibility of discovery, alongside the growing fear that some questions might never be answered. The crime scene preservation efforts that followed Audrey Hayes' disappearance represented both the earnest dedication of rural law enforcement and the tragic limitations that would ultimately compromise the investigation for decades to come. Sheriff Boyle had cordoned off the area around Audrey's abandoned bicycle within hours of its discovery, but the damage from well-meaning volunteers and concerned family members had already been done. Dozens of footprints crisscrossed the soft earth beside County Road 347. Tire tracks from rescue vehicles had obscured any potential evidence on the asphalt, and the bicycle itself had been moved several times before anyone thought to document its original position. The physical evidence collected during those crucial first days filled 3 cardboard boxes stored in the basement of the Hancock County courthouse, a modest collection that spoke more to the limitations of 1976 forensic capabilities than to any lack of effort on the part of investigators. Audrey's bicycle yielded no usable fingerprints beyond those of family members and friends who had handled it regularly. The purse that hung from the handlebars contained only the items Margaret Hayes had confirmed her daughter carried, with no signs of disturbance or tampering. Even the $3 in crumpled bills bore no trace evidence that might have identified an attacker. FBI Special Agent Vance supervised the collection of soil samples, fabric fibers, and trace materials from the abandonment site, but the technology required to analyze such evidence either didn't exist or remained beyond the reach of most law enforcement agencies in rural Mississippi. The samples were carefully labeled, photographed, and stored according to federal protocols, creating a paper trail that would prove invaluable decades later while yielding no immediate insights into Audrey's fate. Vance's methodical documentation included detailed measurements, weather conditions, and photographic evidence that captured every angle of the scene. But the photographs revealed only the absence of obvious clues, rather than hidden secrets waiting to be discovered. The canvassing of local residents produced a frustrating collection of contradictory witness statements that highlighted how unreliable human memory could be under pressure. Mrs. Dorothy Hayes remained certain of her.
If you're like me and don't rest until solving a crime, click and subscribe to the channel.
6:23 p.m. sighting of Audrey on her bicycle, but 3 other witnesses claimed to have seen the girl at different times and locations that evening. A traveling salesman reported observing a young woman matching Audrey's description, talking to someone in a dark-colored pickup truck near the intersection of County Road 347 and Highway 603. But subsequent investigation revealed that the witness had confused the date and was actually recalling an incident from the previous week. Sheriff Boyle's evidence log revealed the department's struggle to apply modern investigative techniques with equipment and training that hadn't kept pace with evolving criminal methodology. Fingerprint analysis required sending samples to the state crime laboratory in Jackson, a process that took weeks and often yielded inconclusive results. Photography was limited to black and white film that captured basic documentation, but missed subtle details that color photography might have revealed. The lack of proper evidence storage facilities meant that crucial materials were kept in whatever containers could be found, often compromising their integrity before analysis could be completed. The investigation's most significant limitation emerged in the handling of potential DNA evidence, a concept that existed only in theoretical discussions among forensic scientists in 1976. Blood samples found on a piece of broken glass near the bicycle were tested only for basic blood typing, a process that eliminated some potential suspects but provided no definitive identification. Hair fibers recovered from the bicycle's handlebars were analyzed for color and texture, but yielded no genetic information that might have pointed investigators toward Audrey's abductor. These samples, carefully preserved according to the best practices of their time, would remain in storage for decades before technology advanced enough to unlock their secrets. The cumulative effect of these evidence-handling limitations created a frustrating situation where investigators possessed potential clues but lacked the tools to interpret them effectively. Each piece of physical evidence represented a question mark rather than an answer, contributing to a growing sense that the case was slipping beyond their reach despite their best efforts. The investigation continued with determination and professional dedication, but the shadow of inadequate resources and technological constraints hung over every aspect of the search for truth. The investigation into Audrey Hayes' disappearance generated a steady stream of suspects whose stories unraveled under scrutiny, each false lead deepening the sense of frustration that began to permeate the Hancock County Sheriff's Department by the summer of 1977. The first major break appeared to come when a drifter named Carl Jameson was arrested for vagrancy in nearby Stone County, carrying identification documents that didn't match his physical description and displaying an intimate knowledge of the area around the Hayes farm that immediately drew investigators' attention. Jameson had been living rough in the pine forests south of Wiggins, surviving on odd jobs and what he could forage or steal from unattended properties. When questioned about his whereabouts on June 15, 1976, his story changed 3 times within the first hour of interrogation. Initially claiming he had been in Alabama during that period, Jameson later admitted to camping within 5 miles of County Road 347 throughout that summer, but insisted he had never seen Audrey Hayes or had any contact with local residents. His nervous demeanor and inconsistent statements convinced Sheriff Boyle that they had found their man. But the conviction lasted only until Jameson's alibi was thoroughly investigated. The breakthrough that cleared Jameson came from an unexpected source: the detailed medical records maintained by the Stone County Health Department's mobile clinic. On June 15, 1976, Jameson had been treated for a severe case of poison ivy exposure at a temporary medical station set up near Hattiesburg, more than 60 miles from the Hayes farm. The attending nurse remembered him clearly because of his agitated behavior and the extent of his skin condition, which had required immediate treatment and follow-up care that kept him under medical supervision for several days. The timeline made it impossible for Jameson to have been involved in Audrey's disappearance, and his release marked the first major disappointment in an investigation that would experience many more. The second significant suspect emerged from within Audrey's own social circle when allegations surfaced about Danny Morrison, a 24-year-old family friend who helped Thomas Hayes with seasonal farm work and had shown what some considered inappropriate interest in the teenage girl. Morrison lived in a converted garage apartment on his parents' property, less than 3 miles from the Hayes farm, and several witnesses confirmed that he had been drinking heavily at Murphy's Tavern on the evening of Audrey's disappearance. His reputation for making crude comments about young women in the community, combined with his proximity to the Hayes family, made him an obvious person of interest. Morrison's interrogation revealed a man whose social awkwardness and poor judgment had been misconstrued as something more sinister. While he admitted to finding Audrey attractive and acknowledged making comments that others might consider inappropriate, Morrison's movements on June 15th were corroborated by multiple witnesses at Murphy's Tavern who remembered his presence because of a loud argument he had gotten into over a pool game. The bartender, Jim Murphy himself, specifically recalled Morrison being too intoxicated to drive home and had arranged for his cousin to pick him up around 9 p.m., well before Audrey's disappearance was even discovered. Morrison submitted to a polygraph examination that, while not legally conclusive, indicated no deception when he denied any involvement in Audrey's disappearance. The investigation's most heartbreaking dead end involved a group of local teenagers who had been swimming at Beaver Creek on the evening Audrey vanished, including her best friend, Jennifer Walsh. Initial interviews had focused on whether any of the group had seen Audrey or noticed anything unusual, but as the investigation intensified, Some of the teenagers found themselves under suspicion simply because they represented the last people Audrey had planned to see. The psychological pressure of being questioned repeatedly about their friend's disappearance while simultaneously being treated as potential suspects created lasting trauma for several of the young people involved. By early 1978, the investigation had effectively stalled, with every promising lead having been exhausted and no new evidence emerging, despite continued efforts by state and federal authorities. The case file had grown thick with reports, witness statements, and laboratory results that collectively painted a picture of thoroughness, but revealed no clear path forward. Sheriff Boyle found himself facing the reality that his department had done everything within their power and expertise, yet Audrey Hayes remained missing, and her fate unknown. The transition from active investigation to cold case status wasn't officially declared, but it became apparent to everyone involved that without new evidence or witnesses, the chances of solving the case were diminishing with each passing month. Margaret Hayes' transformation from grieving mother to relentless investigator began on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in March 1978, when Sheriff Boyle sat in her kitchen and gently explained that while the case would never be officially closed, the active investigation into Audrey's disappearance had reached its practical limits. The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but rather than accepting defeat, she felt something crystallize inside her that would drive her actions for the next 3 decades. That afternoon, she purchased her first composition notebook and began documenting every detail she could remember about the investigation, starting what would become a 30-year archive of information that would eventually fill an entire bedroom in the Hayes farmhouse. The notebooks, written in Margaret's careful cursive handwriting, became repositories for everything the official investigation had missed or dismissed. She recorded conversations with neighbors who had been too afraid to speak to police, documented strange vehicles spotted in the area before and after Audrey's disappearance, and maintained detailed timelines that cross-referenced weather conditions, local events, and potential suspect movements. Margaret's farmer's wife background had taught her the value of meticulous record-keeping, and she applied those same skills to tracking down every possible lead related to her daughter's case. Her crusade took on an almost religious intensity as the years progressed, with Margaret spending her mornings tending to essential farm duties and her afternoons pursuing investigative work that consumed both her energy and the family's financial resources. She subscribed to law enforcement magazines, attended criminal justice seminars open to the public, and educated herself about forensic techniques and investigative procedures that were evolving beyond what rural Mississippi had been able to provide in 1976. The kitchen table that had once hosted family meals became Margaret's command center, covered with maps, photographs, and correspondence with law enforcement agencies across the Southeast. Thomas Hayes watched his wife's obsession with a mixture of admiration and concern, understanding her need to continue the search while worrying about the toll it was taking on her health and their marriage. He supported her efforts financially, even when it meant taking out loans against farm equipment. But the emotional distance that grew between them became another casualty of Audrey's disappearance. Margaret's world had narrowed to a single focus that left little room for other relationships or concerns, and Thomas found himself grieving not only for his lost daughter, but for the woman his wife had been before tragedy reshaped her into someone he barely recognized. The private investigators Margaret hired with money, scraped together from farm profits and borrowed against future crops, represented both hope and heartbreak in equal measure. The first, a former police detective from Jackson named Ray Coleman, spent 6 months reviewing the case files and conducting his own interviews before concluding that the investigation had been thorough despite its limitations. His final report, which cost Margaret nearly $3,000, confirmed what she already knew but provided no new insights into Audrey's fate. Subsequent investigators proved equally unsuccessful, though each promised breakthroughs that never materialized and charged fees that steadily depleted the family's savings. Margaret's correspondence with other families of missing children created a network of shared grief and determination that sustained her through the darkest periods of her search. She exchanged letters with parents from across the country who understood the peculiar agony of not knowing, The way hope and despair could coexist in the same heartbeat, and the frustration of watching the world move forward while their lives remained frozen in the moment their children disappeared. These relationships provided emotional support that local friends and family members, despite their best intentions, simply couldn't offer because they hadn't experienced the specific torture of ambiguous loss. The evidence boxes that Margaret maintained in her attic represented a parallel investigation that was both more personal and more comprehensive than anything law enforcement had been able to sustain. She preserved copies of every official report, photograph, and piece of correspondence related to Audrey's case, but also collected items that had no official investigative value: Audrey's clothes, personal possessions, and school papers that helped Margaret maintain a connection to her daughter's memory. The attic became a shrine to both Audrey's life and the search for truth about her disappearance, a physical manifestation of a mother's refusal to let her child be forgotten or her case abandoned to the passage of time. Detective Lisa Romano had never intended to become the guardian of Hancock County's forgotten victims, but when she transferred from the Jackson Police Department to the Rural Sheriff's Office in January 2019, she brought with her a passion for cold cases that would breathe new life into investigations that had been gathering dust for decades. Romano's background in forensic science and her experience with the state's newly expanded DNA analysis program made her uniquely qualified to review cases from an era when genetic evidence was either ignored or processed with primitive techniques that revealed only a fraction of their potential secrets. The decision to systematically review cold cases using modern forensic technology had been prompted by a grant from the National Institute of Justice, part of a nationwide initiative to address the backlog of unsolved crimes that plagued law enforcement agencies across the country. Romano approached the project with the methodical precision of a scientist and the emotional investment of someone who understood that behind every case file was a family still searching for answers. The Audrey Hayes case immediately caught her attention, not because of its notoriety within the county, but because of the meticulous documentation that Margaret Hayes's decades-long crusade had produced. Romano's first breakthrough came not from advanced laboratory analysis, but from her decision to physically inventory every piece of evidence related to the Hayes case, a process that revealed significant gaps between what had been documented and what remained in storage. The original evidence boxes had been moved multiple times over the years, transferred between storage facilities as the courthouse underwent renovations and space requirements changed. During one of these moves, a fourth box containing trace evidence from the crime scene had been misfiled and forgotten, its existence recorded only in Margaret Hayes's personal notes rather than in official police records. The rediscovered evidence box contained materials that had been collected by FBI Special Agent Vance during the initial investigation, but never subjected to comprehensive analysis due to the technological limitations of 1976. Romano found fabric fibers that had been recovered from Audrey's bicycle, soil samples from the abandonment site, and most significantly, several items of trace evidence that had been preserved with a precision that reflected Vance's federal training, but had never been properly utilized by local investigators. The 43-year gap between collection and analysis had actually worked in favor of preservation, as the evidence had been stored in climate-controlled conditions that protected it from degradation. The breakthrough that would eventually lead to Robert Sullivan's arrest began with Romano's decision to submit every piece of biological evidence to the Mississippi State Crime Laboratory for modern DNA analysis, including samples that had been deemed too small or degraded for testing by earlier forensic standards. Advances in DNA amplification techniques meant that genetic profiles could now be extracted from trace amounts of biological material that would have been considered worthless in previous decades. The process required patience and significant financial resources, but Romano convinced Sheriff Patterson that the potential for solving decades-old cases justified the investment. The laboratory results that arrived in Romano's inbox on a quiet Tuesday morning in October 2019 contained genetic profiles extracted from multiple pieces of evidence, including partial DNA sequences that had been recovered from fabric fibers found on Audrey's bicycle. The profiles were incomplete and degraded, but they contained enough genetic information to potentially identify a suspect if that person's DNA existed in law enforcement databases or if familial connections could be established through genealogical research. Romano understood that she was looking at the first real lead in the Audrey Hayes case since the investigation had gone cold in 1978. The integration of genetic genealogy into criminal investigations represented a revolutionary development in forensic science that had already solved dozens of cold cases across the country, but its application required specialized expertise that was beyond the capabilities of most rural law enforcement agencies. Romano spent weeks researching genetic genealogy companies and consulting with experts who had successfully used the technique to identify suspects in similar cases. The process would be time-consuming and expensive, but for the first time since Audrey Hayes' disappearance, investigators had evidence that might actually lead them to her killer. The technology that had seemed like science fiction when Margaret Hayes began her crusade had finally advanced to the point where her daughter's case might find the resolution that had eluded 3 generations of law enforcement officers. The genetic genealogy investigation that would ultimately identify Robert Sullivan as Audrey Hayes' killer began with the submission of degraded DNA samples to Family Tree DNA and GED Match, databases that contained genetic profiles from millions of people who had voluntarily uploaded their information for genealogical research purposes. The process required Detective Romano to work closely with genetic genealogist Dr. Audrey Vance, a specialist who had helped solve over 30 cold cases by using DNA evidence to construct family trees that led investigators to potential suspects through process of elimination. Dr. Vance's initial analysis of the DNA evidence revealed that the perpetrator was likely of mixed European ancestry, with genetic markers suggesting Irish, German, and possibly French heritage, a combination that was common among the population of rural Mississippi. The genetic profile matched approximately 1,200 people in the combined databases at various levels of kinship, creating a massive investigative challenge that required methodical.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
Research into multiple family lineages spanning several generations. Vance explained to Romano that the process was similar to solving a complex puzzle where each genetic match represented a potential piece that might eventually reveal the complete picture. The breakthrough came through a third cousin match with a woman named Patricia Sullivan Weber, who had uploaded her DNA results while researching her family's immigration history from Ireland in the mid-1800s. Vance's analysis indicated that Patricia and the unknown perpetrator shared a common ancestor approximately 4 generations back, narrowing the investigation to descendants of Patrick and Bridget Sullivan, who had settled in Mississippi after the Civil War. The Sullivan family tree revealed dozens of potential suspects scattered across the Southeast, but Vance's methodical approach began eliminating candidates based on age, location, and availability of comparison DNA samples. Romano spent weeks traveling across Mississippi and neighboring states, conducting surveillance and collecting discarded DNA samples from male descendants of the Sullivan lineage who fit the age profile for Audrey's killer. The process required extraordinary patience and careful legal maneuvering to ensure that evidence collection would be admissible in court while respecting the privacy rights of individuals who had no knowledge of their connection to a decades-old crime. Romano collected DNA from cigarette butts, discarded coffee cups, and other items that suspects had abandoned in public spaces, building a library of genetic profiles that Vance could compare to the evidence from the crime scene. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Vance's research revealed that one branch of the Sullivan family had remained in Hancock County throughout the period since Audrey's disappearance, contradicting the assumption that the perpetrator had fled the area after committing the crime. Robert Eugene Sullivan emerged as a person of interest when Romano discovered that he had been 19 years old in 1976 and living with his parents on a small farm just 3 miles from the Hayes property. Sullivan's name had never appeared in the original investigation files, despite his proximity to the crime scene and his presence in the community during the crucial time period. The surveillance of Robert Sullivan presented unique challenges because of his isolated lifestyle and the small size of the community where any unusual activity would be immediately noticed. Romano spent months establishing patterns of Sullivan's daily routine, learning that he visited the same convenience store every Tuesday morning for coffee and lottery tickets, providing a predictable opportunity for DNA collection. The genetic profile extracted from Sullivan's discarded coffee cup matched the crime scene evidence with a statistical probability that exceeded legal standards for criminal prosecution, finally providing investigators with definitive identification of Audrey Hayes' killer after 43 years of uncertainty. The confirmation of Sullivan's identity through DNA evidence created a surreal moment for Romano, who realized she was looking at surveillance photographs of a man who had been living freely in the same community where he had committed murder as a teenager. Sullivan's unremarkable appearance and quiet lifestyle had provided perfect camouflage for nearly 5 decades, allowing him to hide in plain sight while the Hayes family suffered through decades of uncertainty and grief. The weight of that revelation, combined with the knowledge that Margaret Hayes had died without ever learning her daughter's killer had been living just miles away, created an emotional complexity that Romano struggled to process even as she prepared for Sullivan's arrest. The genetic evidence that would finally bring Robert Sullivan to justice represented the convergence of cutting-edge forensic science with the painstaking investigative work that had preserved Audrey Hayes' case for future generations. The technology that solved the case in 2019 had been unimaginable when Margaret Hayes began her lonely crusade for answers, but her refusal to let her daughter be forgotten had maintained the pressure that ultimately led to this breakthrough. As Romano prepared the arrest warrant that would end Sullivan's freedom, she knew that the real victory belonged to a mother who had never lived to see this day but whose determination had made it possible. The surveillance of Robert Sullivan during the final weeks of 2024 revealed a man whose daily routines had remained virtually unchanged for decades. A creature of habit whose predictable patterns made the investigation both easier and more disturbing for Detective Romano and her team. Sullivan's morning walks along the same dirt roads where Audrey Hayes had once ridden her bicycle created an eerie symmetry that wasn't lost on the investigators who watched him through telephoto lenses and listened to his conversations through electronic surveillance equipment. The man who had destroyed the Hayes family's life had spent nearly 50 years living within sight of the crime scene, passing the spot where he had abandoned Audrey's bicycle hundreds of times without apparent concern or remorse. The decision to arrest Sullivan at his trailer home on that frigid January morning was carefully orchestrated to minimize the risk of flight or violence, though Romano had concluded from months of observation that Sullivan posed little physical threat to the arrest team. The man they took into custody appeared genuinely confused by the sudden appearance of law enforcement officers, asking repeatedly whether there had been some mistake while he was read his rights and placed in handcuffs that seemed almost too large for his weathered wrists. His neighbors, watching from their windows as Sullivan was led to a patrol car, would later describe their shock at seeing the quiet man, who had helped them with yard work and snow removal, being arrested for a crime they had never suspected he was capable of committing. The interrogation room at the Hancock County Sheriff's Department had seen its share of confessions over the years, but the interview with Robert Sullivan would prove to be unlike anything Detective Romano had experienced during her career in law enforcement. Sullivan sat across from her with his hands folded in his lap, displaying none of the agitation or defiance that typically characterized suspects facing serious criminal charges. Instead, he seemed almost relieved to finally be sitting in that chair, as if the weight of 48 years of secrecy had become too heavy for him to carry any longer. Romano began the interview with standard questions about Sullivan's background and whereabouts, establishing baseline responses that would help her detect deception when more sensitive topics were introduced. Sullivan answered with quiet honesty about his work history, his family relationships, and his daily routines, never once asking for a lawyer or expressing concern about the implications of the DNA evidence that had led to his arrest. His demeanor suggested a man who had been waiting for this moment for decades, someone who understood that his carefully constructed life of isolation and routine had always been temporary. The breakthrough came when Romano showed Sullivan a photograph of Audrey Hayes taken just weeks before her disappearance, a school portrait that captured the bright smile and innocent eyes of a girl who had never imagined that her life would end on a lonely country road. Sullivan's reaction was immediate and devastating. His face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine grief, and tears began streaming down his cheeks as he stared at the photograph with the intensity of someone seeing a ghost from his past. The silence that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, during which Sullivan seemed to age years before Romano's eyes. When Sullivan finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but his words carried the weight of nearly 5 decades of suppressed guilt and self-loathing. He began by asking Romano whether Margaret Hayes was still alive, and when informed that Audrey's mother had died in 2008, Sullivan's composure completely collapsed. The confession that followed was delivered in fragments, interrupted by long periods of sobbing. As Sullivan described the impulsive act of violence that had destroyed not only Audrey's life, but his own capacity for happiness or peace. The details that emerged during Sullivan's confession painted a picture of a crime that had been neither premeditated nor sexually motivated, but rather the result of a moment of panic and poor judgment that had spiraled beyond his ability to control. Sullivan described approaching Audrey as she rode her bicycle that evening, initially intending only to talk to her, but becoming violent when she tried to flee from his unwanted advances. The location where he had buried Audrey's body, revealed through tears and stammered directions, would finally give the Hayes family the closure they had sought for nearly half a century. The news of Robert Sullivan's arrest and confession spread through Hancock County like wildfire, creating ripple effects that reached far beyond the immediate community and touched the lives of everyone who had been affected by Audrey Hayes' disappearance over the preceding decades. Jennifer Walsh, now 59 years old and living in Mobile, Alabama, received the phone call from Detective Romano while she was preparing dinner for her grandchildren, and the shock of finally learning what had happened to her best friend sent her to her knees in her kitchen, sobbing with a mixture of relief and renewed grief that she hadn't experienced since those terrible summer days in 1976. The surviving members of the Hayes family faced the complex emotions that accompany delayed justice, finding that the resolution they had hoped for brought its own unexpected challenges. Thomas Hayes, now 83 and living in a nursing home in Biloxi, struggled to process the news that his daughter's killer had been someone he had known, a young man who had occasionally helped with farm work and had attended the same church where the family had prayed for Audrey's safe return. The revelation that Sullivan had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 50 years added a layer of betrayal to the grief that Thomas had carried since 1976, making him question every interaction he had ever had with neighbors and community members. Audrey's younger brother, Michael Hayes, who had been only 12 when his sister disappeared, found himself grappling with emotions he had thought were buried forever. Now a successful contractor living in Hattiesburg with a family of his own, Michael had spent his adult life avoiding discussions about Audrey's case and had largely made peace with the likelihood that it would never be solved. Sullivan's confession forced him to confront the reality that his sister's killer had been living freely, while his own family had endured decades of uncertainty and pain, creating an anger that surprised him with its intensity and persistence. The legal proceedings that followed Sullivan's arrest moved with unusual swiftness for a case of such vintage, partly because the defendant's confession eliminated many of the evidentiary challenges that typically complicate decades-old prosecutions. District Attorney Patricia Montgomery, who had taken office with a commitment to addressing cold cases, found herself handling the most significant prosecution of her career while navigating the intense media attention that surrounded the case. Sullivan's decision to plead guilty to second-degree murder spared the community the trauma of a lengthy trial, but it also denied many people the closure that might have come from hearing the complete details of what had happened to Audrey Hayes. The sentencing hearing at the Hancock County Courthouse drew crowds that hadn't been seen since the initial search for Audrey in 1976, with many of the same people who had volunteered for those efforts now appearing to witness the conclusion of the case that had haunted their community for half a century. Sullivan's appearance at the hearing, frail and clearly broken by his confession, created a complex emotional response among spectators who struggled to reconcile the elderly man before them with the monster they had imagined for so many years. His statement to the court, delivered in a trembling voice, expressed remorse that seemed genuine, but felt inadequate in the face of the decades of suffering his actions had caused. Judge Raymond Foster's decision to sentence Sullivan to 25 years in prison reflected both the severity of his crime and the recognition that the defendant was unlikely to survive a longer term of incarceration. The sentence satisfied few people completely, with some feeling that Sullivan had received too little punishment for a crime that had destroyed multiple lives, while others argued that sending a 67-year-old man to prison for what would likely be the remainder of his life served no constructive purpose. The debate over appropriate punishment for decades-old crimes highlighted the complex intersection of justice, mercy, and practical considerations that characterize cold case prosecutions. The resolution of Audrey Hayes' case provided a form of closure that had seemed impossible for nearly 50 years, but it also forced the Hancock County community to confront uncomfortable questions about how well they had known their neighbors and whether other secrets might be hiding beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful rural existence. The case had defined the community for half a century, serving as a reminder of how quickly innocence could be shattered and how long the search for truth could take. Now that the mystery was solved, residents found themselves adjusting to a reality where Audrey Hayes' story had an ending, even if that ending brought more pain than peace. If you found yourself drawn into Audrey's story, wondering how a small community could harbor such secrets for so long, consider subscribing to stay updated on similar cases where time, technology, and determination finally converged to deliver justice to families who never stopped searching for answers.